just the incredible surprise, shall I say, to put it gently, of finding a biological man, a 6'4" biological man in your locker room and having to accept that without being asked about it, without being told about it even. What was that like for you? Tell us about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Ms. Gaines, I want to start with you. Thank you for your courage in being here today. Thank you for your courage and advocacy for women. You have been subjected to an unbelievable amount of abuse. You talk about intimidation, threats of violence. You have suffered it. I want to put up here a picture so everybody can see it. This was the welcome you were treated to at San Francisco State University just a couple of months ago when a mob assembled where you were supposed to speak, I believe for over 3 hours, screamed, threatened you, barricaded you in a room. Do I have that basically correct?
Yes. I was held for ransom for 3.5 hours. By hundreds of these protesters, as you see on the board. They demanded that I had to pay them money if I wanted to make it home to see my family safe again. The law enforcement in San Francisco, I respect, and I think law enforcement is what's brave, not me, and I respect all law enforcement, but the law enforcement I was met with in San Francisco, in my opinion, failed miserably in effectively doing their job. They had mentioned that it was not ideal for them to be seen as anything other than an ally to this community. And that was made very obvious in the treatment and effectiveness of removing me safely from that situation.
Why were you threatened and barricaded into a room and held for ransom for hours on end? I mean, what was it you were saying that was so terrible?
I was invited to speak on my experience of my senior year in competing against a male. Nothing opinionated about what I shared. It was sheerly the exact lived experience of what me and my teammates and fellow competitors dealt with. And so I spoke. After my speech, there was, of course, a lot of protesters in the room, which I'm totally fine with people protesting. It's their right to protest. But what I'm not fine with is when it does turn violent in the way that it did. Because protesters afterwards, they rushed into the room. They turned off the lights. They rushed to the front. Myself and others were assaulted, and that's ultimately when I was held for hostage for 3.5 hours.
It's just unbelievable, unbelievable. Thank you for your courage in the midst of that. Let's talk a little bit about the message that you were sharing, and you started to talk about it in your opening statement. Just tell us about your experience, because nobody can question your experience. I don't think anybody sitting at the table, and certainly nobody at this podium, has had the experience that you have had. You were talking about just the incredible surprise, shall I say, to put it gently, of finding a biological man, a 6'4" biological man in your locker room and having to accept that without being asked about it, without being told about it even. What was that like for you? Tell us about that.
Again, we only became aware we would be undressing next to a man was when we had to see a man undressing while we were simultaneously undressing. And so I immediately left the locker room and I went up to one of the officials on the pool deck and I said, what are the guidelines to allow a man into our locker room? I know the guidelines for the competition, but what are the guidelines for the locker room? And he so nonchalantly said back, oh, we actually got around this by making locker rooms unisex. And so I'm thinking to myself in these brief moments, first and foremost, you just admitted this is a male by acknowledging how you had to change your rules to make the locker rooms unisex. You acknowledge that we do not share the same sex, first and foremost. Secondly, unisex? Any man could have walked into our locker room, any coach, any official, any man who wanted to would have had full reins to, and bare minimum, we weren't forewarned about it. And that's the traumatizing part. Of course, the experience in and of the locker room itself is traumatizing, but I think for me, it was so easy for them to dismiss our rights to privacy. Senator Durbin, in your opening statement, you had mentioned this rhetoric. It's, you had mentioned that, what message does it send to trans individuals? And my combat to that is, what message does this send to women, to young girls who are denied of these opportunities? So easily their rights to privacy and safety thrown out of the window to protect a small population, protect one group as long as they're happy. What about us? That is the overall general consensus of how we all felt in that locker room.
Why do you think it is that the NCAA and so many people in power seem intent on just erasing your opinion, your views, the whole category of women? I noticed that recently you just posted this to social media about a message that Harvard was sending around, I think, to its swimmers, telling them, don't talk about Lia Thomas, don't share your opinions. If you get contacted by a member of the media, then refer that to the university. Don't say anything, for heaven's sake. Tell us about this. I mean, this has been your experience over and over and over. You're told as a woman to shut up, don't say anything. What's that like?
That is continually happening. And if we do speak up, you're immediately labeled as some name. They will call you everything under the sun, whether it's transphobic, homophobic, racist, white supremacist, domestic terrorist. They will throw them all at you in hopes to deter you, in hopes to silence you. Lia Thomas's teammates, they were forced every single week to go to mandatory LGBTQ education meetings to learn about how just by being cisgender, they were oppressing Lia Thomas. They were told that they are not allowed to take a stance because their school has already taken their stance for them. They were told that you will never get a job, you will never get into grad school, you will lose your friends, you will lose your scholarship and playing time if you speak out. They told these girls that if you do speak out, and any harm whatsoever comes towards Thomas's way, whether that's through social media, whether that's physical, mental, emotional harm, then you are solely responsible, and you could be responsible for a potential death. And you don't want that, do you? Of course not. Who would ever want to be responsible in a potential death? But that is the emotional blackmail that is plaguing this country, especially in universities.
Last question, and I'll ask this and then give you a chance to respond, and I'm done with this, Mr. Chairman. Let me give you a chance to respond to something that Lia Thomas said recently, publicly. She said this publicly. They're using, this quote now, they're using the guise of feminism, they meaning you, using the guise of feminism to sort of push transphobic beliefs, meaning you advocating for women, women's rights is actually just a cover for transphobia. Do you want to respond to that?
Feminism is not a fluid term. The original and the meaning of what it means to be a feminist is to uphold, respect, honor, embrace, and celebrate women on our own physical ceilings, our own uniqueness. That term has not changed. And what this really is a male mansplaining what it is to be a feminist, which I honestly think is pretty ironic, and it's something we've seen before.
Thank you, Senator Hawley.
All right, I just finished watching that hearing clip, and honestly, it's one of those moments that makes you stop and think about what's really happening in our country right now. Before we dive into it, welcome back to Straight Talk Politics. If you're someone who believes in honest conversations, common sense, and standing up for the truth no matter how uncomfortable it gets, then you're in the right place. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and leave a comment below because I want to hear your thoughts on this story. Do you think what happened here is fair, or do you think the system is failing women? Let me know. Now let's talk about what we just saw. In this Senate hearing, Senator Josh Hawley sat down with former NCAA swimmer Riley Gaines, and what she described was honestly unbelievable. Gaines talked about a speaking event she had at San Francisco State University. She was invited there to talk about her experience competing in women's sports and about what happened when she had to compete against a biological male swimmer. But instead of a normal speaking event or even a peaceful protest, what happened turned into chaos. According to Gaines, hundreds of protesters showed up. They weren't just holding signs or chanting from outside. They flooded the event, shut down the conversation, and then things escalated even further. She described being trapped inside the building for hours. The doors were blocked. People were yelling threats. Lights were turned off. She said at one point protesters even demanded money if she wanted to leave safely. Think about that for a second. A woman invited to speak at university, an American university, ended up being barricaded inside a room for over 3 hours because people didn't like her viewpoint. That's not debate. That's not democracy. That's intimidation. And what might be even more shocking is what Gaines said about the response from authorities. She said law enforcement failed to handle the situation properly, and that officers seemed hesitant to act because they didn't want to appear opposed to the protesters. If that's true, that raises a serious question. When did protecting free speech become optional? But the hearing didn't stop there. Gaines also described what happened during her time competing in NCAA swimming. She talked about the moment she and her teammates discovered they would be sharing a locker room with a biological male. According to her testimony, there was no warning, no conversation, no discussion with the athletes. They simply walked into the locker room, and suddenly the rules had changed. When she asked officials what the policy was, she said she was told the locker rooms were made unisex to work around the situation. For Gaines and her teammates, that moment was deeply uncomfortable. From her perspective, it wasn't just about competition anymore. It was about privacy and basic boundaries. Now, whether you agree with her position or not, this is where the bigger debate in America comes in. For decades, women's sports existed to create fair competition. Biological differences between men and women were the reason those leagues and scholarships were created in the first place. Without them, many female athletes would never have had the chance to compete at the highest level. Gaines argues that those opportunities are now at risk. She also said something else during the hearing that really stood out. She claimed female athletes who speak up about these concerns are often pressured to stay silent. According to her testimony, athletes were told speaking out could cost them scholarships, careers, friendships, and future opportunities. Imagine being a college athlete in that position. You have trained your entire life. Your scholarship is on the line. Your future career might depend on keeping your head down. Are most people going to risk everything just to voice an opinion? Probably not. That's the kind of environment Gaines says exists right now on many campuses. Then Senator Hawley brought up a comment made by Lia Thomas, the transgender swimmer at the center of the controversy. Thomas had said critics were using feminism as a cover for transphobia. Gaines responded by saying something that sparked a lot of reaction online. She said feminism was originally about respecting and protecting women and their unique biological differences. From her perspective, allowing biological males into women's sports contradicts that mission. Whether someone agrees or disagrees with her, one thing is clear. This issue has become one of the most emotionally charged debates in modern politics. And here's the part that concerns a lot of people on the conservative side. It's not just the policy debate anymore. It's the reaction to disagreement. Instead of open discussion, we're seeing protests that shut down speech. Instead of debate, people are being labeled and attacked. Gaines even said women who speak out are often called hateful names or accused of being bigots simply for expressing their concerns. That's not healthy for a free society. America was built on the idea that people can disagree, sometimes strongly, without trying to silence each other. Universities, especially, were supposed to be places where difficult conversations could happen. But when speakers are barricaded in rooms, when protests turn into intimidation, when students are told their careers could be destroyed for speaking honestly, something has gone very wrong. Now look, people can have different views about transgender participation in sports. That's a complicated issue. It deserves serious discussion, serious science, and thoughtful policy. But shutting down the conversation entirely? That helps nobody. What this hearing shows is that the debate is far from over. In fact, it may just be getting started. And millions of Americans are watching closely. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think women's sports should remain separated based on biological sex? Do you think universities are protecting free speech, or are they shutting it down? And what do you think about Riley Gaines' experience at that campus event? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the discussion going. And if you want more straight, honest political analysis without the mainstream media spin, make sure you subscribe to Straight Talk Politics. Like this video, and share it with someone who needs to see it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.